What's up, guys? Welcome back to another episode of the Social Standard Podcast. I'm your host, Jess Phillips, and my guest today is Paul Riismandel, the president at Signal Hill Insights, which is a research and measurement firm helping broadcasters, publishers, and podcasters tap into new opportunities in audio. If you are a brand who has been interested in podcast advertising via influencers or even just ad buys, this is the episode for you. Paul is a complete and utter expert in the space, and we are diving into all the ways to perfect your strategy. But before we start that conversation, make sure you like and subscribe this video if you found it valuable, and please connect me on LinkedIn. I'll link it below. Without further ado, let's dive in. 142 million Americans are spending time monthly consuming podcasts. That's almost half the population. But on our side, we're not seeing this be mission critical for brands and all of their marketing strategies. So that leads me to believe that we're just still at the beginning of the podcast market. So my question for you is, where are we in your view? Are we nascent? Are we coming up? Are we mature? What does the podcast market look like to you in terms of growth stage?
Well, so actually, a majority of U.S. adults currently consume podcasts, actually. So we've crested that 50% mark. We've actually crested it back at the end of 2024, and it continues apace this year. I like to say it's kind of a young adulthood, actually, in terms of the actual maturity of the platform from the standpoint, one, of reach, right? Reaching a majority of people every month in the United States. And as well, it's very mature in terms of content. It's very mature in terms of audience, in terms of a very firm relationship. So if it's not quite mature, it is in terms of brands recognizing this, I think, and taking advantage of everything that podcasting has to offer.
Yeah, that makes sense to me. I'm surprised that we're not seeing it in more marketing plans, I guess, is where my sort of hesitation or questioning of the market's kind of capacity is. I mean, is there a reason that you think that is happening? Is there an issue with the quantity of podcasts? Is it a time thing? Is it like what do you think it is that's limiting brands from diving in all the way?
I think what I hear often is it's sort of mechanical. It is the actual buying process. Podcasting is not highly consolidated. It's one of its strengths as a medium, but it means that it's not as much one-stop shopping. Mm-hmm. I mean, you want to buy YouTube, you buy YouTube. You want to buy Meta, you buy Meta. And with podcasting, there's not, I want to buy podcasting, I buy podcasting. No, you work with different publishers. You might work with different larger or smaller publishers, depending on what your niche is and where you're going. Mm-hmm. There have been strides made in programmatic and private marketplace buying so that you can certainly buy more at a time. Right. And certainly at this point, it's mature that you can buy based upon lots of different signals, whether those signals are content or demographics, audience, etc. But it does require a little bit more work on behalf of buyers, frankly. And I do think that that's enough friction in many cases for some agencies.
Yeah, I agree wholeheartedly. And I think we've seen the same thing parallel through influencer marketing in the very beginning. You didn't even know how to reach out to someone and get in contact. I mean, there wasn't the email button on your Instagram profile, none of this. So it was very challenging. And as influencer marketing has continued to mature, we've seen that obviously the same type of things coming up, right? Where you have networks, you have people, you've got easy ways to get in contact. And it still can be a little bit of a helter-skelter process, but the known outweighs the unknown in influencer marketing at the moment. Yeah.
I think so. And thinking about podcasters as influencers is a good frame as well. Yeah. And in some ways, podcasters were influencers before we had the word in the way that we use it today. And one way to think about it is it's influencers at scale, because frankly, from a scale point of view and the number of personalities and shows that you can buy, simply, it's easier to buy that scale with podcasting in a lot of ways.
Okay. Tell me why. Tell me why you say that, because I would disagree with that.
Yeah. I mean, so if you were to try and work with kind of any major publisher in podcasting, whether we're talking about one of the larger audio conglomerates like an iHeart or SiriusXM or Odyssey, or you're talking about sort of a more pure play kind of podcasting company, whether it's on a larger scale, like an Acast or Audio Boom, or you're working with someone more boutique, you can get to dozens of individual podcasts, individual influencers, if you will, with a single buy. If you're willing to go to them and you're willing to open up the coffers there in order to do that. I don't know, and perhaps it's my own ignorance, how easy it is to do that with social media influencers. How easy is it to get 24 social media influencers on one plan and one buy with a single?
I will tell you,
source?
it's so easy. We do it all the time. So in your example of like iHeart, for example, the social standard would be that comparable. So a brand comes to us and they say, hey, we have, $150,000. This is what we're looking for. We can say, great, we can get you, depending on size and reach of the influencer, we can get you one influencer or we can get you 50.
Okay, that's great. I mean, that's great to hear, actually. But I think it's important to acknowledge that sort of podcasting does this and has been doing this.
Yeah.
I mean, so I've been in commercial podcasting, working in the industry for 11 years.
Sure.
And my start in the industry was actually in sales marketing. So putting together the marketing plans to buyers and agencies and brands. And even at that time, the company I worked for was Midroll Media, which is really one of the first successful ad networks in podcasting, an aggregator, playing much the role that you're playing.
Great.
But within podcasting, and even at that time in 2014, we had hundreds of shows in our roster that we could immediately deliver to advertisers if they so wanted. And that only grew and grew. Eventually the company was acquired by SiriusXM Satellite Radio, right? And has become basically their podcasting division. So yeah, I mean, the scale has been there. But I think I suspect that there's a bit of a mental shift that in the way that perhaps brands and buyers think about podcasting is they lump it in with radio, right? Or they lump in a lot of ways, or think about it in the way they think about broadcast, right? Rather than thinking about it. Now, obviously, there are some very smart brands who've made a lot of really good money thinking about podcasters as influencers. And we've all heard their ads because they're so effective at it. But I think, when we get to more probably into larger agencies, when they're thinking about it as audio and thinking about it more like streaming or more like, then it doesn't quite match up with their expectations, right?
Correct. Yes.
Podcasting comes with a premium because it delivers on that premium.
Yeah.
It's not as commodity as buying ads on streaming audio or radio for that matter. But I think it's very often still being thought of that way rather than being thought of is part of those, the kind of influencer buy, because it has that kind of influencer action.
Yes. And that makes a lot of sense, because I know that when influencers were something, and we even still say this, but influencers were in its more kind of growth stage, it was very confusing. People didn't know where to house this. Should this come from the social media budget? Should it come from the content budget? Should it come from the media buying budget, right? Because it was actually all of these things in one, which is the same as podcasts, really.
Yeah.
Right?
And the smart brands have a podcasting budget, right? I mean,
yes,
the ones who have really, really made much of their fortune on podcasting treat it as its own channel.
So what would be one of those brands that you would just top of mind that has made it really?
I mean, I think BetterHelp is sort of unavoidable, right? In that way. I mean, and I that's not I say that with full respect, right?
Yeah.
Early on in the space, it was brands like Squarespace. I think that there continue to be brands, and I think we are starting to see larger, blue chip brands, larger consumer brands, all beginning to do this as well in the last few years. And if you look at sort of if you're aware of Magellan, every month they list out the top buyers in podcasting, and you're seeing more top consumer brands in that top 10 list.
Okay, interesting.
And alongside with a lot of direct to consumer or brands that really clearly make a lot of their investment in podcasting.
Yeah, that's definitely true. I mean, I think you can go through certain brands like BetterHelp, for example, and they are on almost all the major podcasts, right?
Yeah, they understand the reach and scale that really is there, and then take advantage of the fact that you have hosts that will advocate for their product, right? It's a kind of product didn't exist 6 years ago, 7 years ago. I'm not sure what the life cycle is there. And podcasting has been a big part of that growth strategy. In my own business at Signal Hill Insights, a big portion of it is doing brand lift research, right?
Yeah,
So we do
right.
this gauging the effect of campaigns.
Mhm.
And in brand lift, we are mostly doing it for large brands
Right.
and their campaigns. And what we're doing a lot of work in right now, and has been a really big factor of growth in the last 18 months, has been deeper sorts of integrations with podcasters.
Is that
Really
the branded
leaning in.
content? Mhm.
Yeah, it's a whole spectrum of branded content.
Yeah. Yeah. So let's get into that. Okay. So when people are coming to you and you're saying they want to do a brand list study, this is great. I have two questions. One, what is like, generally my experience with brand list studies is they only make sense to do if you have a bigger marketing budget that you're putting towards things, right? Because there is a cost of the brand lift study naturally. So you want to make sure that it's worth it. So what are spends that make sense for a brand lift study on podcasts? And then let's talk about those modalities. Like how are people showing up and creating content for podcasts in ways that are successful?
Yeah. I mean, frankly, in podcasting, a lot of the research is done as added value.
Okay.
Right. So
Yeah.
it's definitely on the side. So it's harder for me to speak specifically to the kind of spends, but we're seeing large spends ultimately.
Yeah.
They are definitely,
like you're talking like six-figure spends,
definitely
six-figure
six-figure
plus.
spends. Yeah. Under 6 figures, it's difficult to do the research. And honestly, if you're spending less than 6 figures, you're not spending enough. I mean, I'm just going to say that. I'm going to say that outright.
Great. That's huge. Yeah. Okay. You're not spending enough. If you're not spending 6 figures on podcast advertising, you're not spending enough to move the needle, or you're not spending enough to like make an impact. You're not spending enough for a brand list study, like nothing, right?
Yeah. I mean,
Okay.
So I'm going to curtail that a little bit and just say, if you're an emerging brand, if you're a highly niche brand, I think you can get a lot of great effect under that. But if you are a brand who is otherwise spending 7, 8, and 9 figures on other channels, and you're not spending 6 figures on podcasting, you can't possibly expect to move the needle in a way that you will be able to read and see and compare.
Okay. Got you. That makes perfect sense.
Right?
Thank you for that. Yeah.
And so certainly when we're measuring a campaign, typically it is something that is 6 figures to 7 figures. And the type of integrations we're seeing are things that we often call like a branded segment.
Okay.
Right. So that's where instead of, most typically we have pre-rolls at the beginning, mid-rolls at the center, post-rolls at the end. At the ends, they tend to be 15 to 30 seconds. In the center, they tend to be about a minute mid-roll. These aren't rules, but it's a tendency.
Sure.
And a segment might be a few minutes.
Okay.
Might be as much as 10. Might be a special interview segment. Maybe you are an alcohol brand and the host is going to talk about a particular drink recipe, right?
Got it.
That's just one implication, but you might be an auto brand, right? And maybe it's a road trip segment now that we're going to talk about every week.
And that's the brought to you by Buick.
It's a brought to you by kind of thing, right? And typically what we see works well is when it's a fairly organic integration, but it's not an infomercial. Right. This isn't 10 or 15 minutes all about the features of a particular new electric vehicle. It's that we had all this fun, we had all these great times, and it happened to be in this vehicle. And maybe along the way, it's a feature of the vehicle. It's so great that we have, a real power outlet and we were able to have our mini fridge along, and things like this, but not so much like, it's a full on extolling the virtues of this product the entire time. We also see kind of, different types of what we would call 100% share of voice kind of takeovers.
Okay.
So this can be a bonus episode. So we've got this special episode with this special guest brought to you only by this brand.
Oh, so it's not someone from the brand. It is literally, it's somebody who probably speaks to something again, like maybe it's the mixologist that's coming on the show. And
it could be that, or it can just simply be someone special, like just someone that we know that audience is really eager to hear from. And it's just the halo effect, right, is what we call it. You're going to think better of the brand because they brought you this episode you might not otherwise get. So maybe it's a show that's weekly. We've got an extra episode on Thursday.
Yes.
It's a special interview brought to you exclusively. And so probably it's, there's not much of an ad load, right?
Yeah.
So maybe depending on the integration, it might even be more of just like a pre-mid post, but it's the only brand heard. And so they get much more credit and they'll say, oh, and we're happy to bring you this with minimal interruption, thanks to this brand. So we're seeing that. We're seeing that sort of thing. Or we're seeing kind of like branded miniseries. And so this again is usually a little bit about bonus content. And maybe it's not, maybe if it's a typical episode is an hour, maybe they're just 20 minutes. They're branded and can be on brand, right? So
Sure.
again, maybe it's a outdoor brand because it's a special that's going to be all about camping, or a special all about cooking out, or something like this. So again, very much on brand, but the sponsorship is still like it's presented by, it's brought to you by, and maybe you get a little bit more voice in the matter, but it's not an infomercial for the product.
Yes,
right?
that makes sense.
It's not, right?
Okay.
Because podcasting infomercials doesn't work.
Correct. Yeah.
Podcasting is a lean in, it's a selective medium. You don't stumble on a podcast for the most part, right? You select this and you select it carefully. And the smartest podcasters and the brands they work with understand this and respect that time. But then the trade-off is, as you understand with influencers, the audience trusts that podcaster to bring them something of value, right? If they're working with that brand, there's some vetting, right? There's something organic to that relationship that they trust.
Yes.
Yeah.
That makes
sense.
So
those are some of the integrations we're seeing specifically, and these are ways in which brands are working with existing podcasts, right? So they're not a branded podcast. So that's something we also research, but we're seeing much more of these kind of deeper integrations.
Yeah. And that does make sense to me. As I'm thinking about it though, when you're doing these branded series like that, this feels very dialed in, right? This feels like we're coming to the table. Like this is something Sirius XM is doing, or iHeart, radio is doing, or just iHeartMedia now, I guess. But if it's an influencer who does all of their own stuff and maybe they have their own company, I haven't seen that as much. Like in the offerings, I've seen them kind of start to sniff around this, but it's not quite as elaborate. It feels a little bit more nascent. And the other thing that I'm thinking is, NPR, sure, it makes sense for them to do a branded segment, but are they going to do a branded segment with someone who talks a little bit more about lifestyle? And it's, it's guests and it's interviews, right?
Yeah. I mean, it depends on the program, right?
Yeah.
I mean, that's a lot of it, right? It's even if you go into sort of the parallel to NPR, it's probably not a good fit for the Daily. Right. It's a news program. It's important for them to maintain a particular type of tone. Obviously, the hosts are journalists, so there are more firewalls there.
Yeah.
But then when you get into, I think, some programs that are either public radio like, but are less straight journalism, like How I Built This or something like this, there tend to be a lot more flexibility in that. I think you start to see this. And we have definitely measured these sorts of deeper integrations with smaller networks, pure play podcast networks. So not only sort of the really big ones, but also with ones that are, growing, represent a lot of podcasts, but are very much strictly podcast only sorts of networks. And we have definitely executed these sorts of studies for them. We've also worked with some properties that have podcasting in their mix. So they might, so that it's a full on kind of brand that has a number of different channels. Podcasting is one of them. Do their own sales, or do a very large percentage of their own sales, and do these kinds of deeper brand integrations, because that's the nature of their business. Right.
Yeah.
They may have a web property, they may have a YouTube property or video property, they have a podcast property that are discrete, different products, not just, they're not simulcasts, if you will.
Right.
But they do these integrations on a podcast, and we have measured those as well.
Yeah, that all makes a lot of sense to me. That's really interesting. And it feels a lot like, I think if I were to draw the parallel to influencer marketing, this feels like when someone is doing a YouTube video and they integrate it where it's not pre-roll, it's not mid-roll, it's nothing automatic. It's actually just something that the influencers film and they bake it into. And that's brilliant because the long tail there is wonderful, right?
Yeah,
you don't
absolutely.
have to worry about something going off in 1 month and it's out. It's there, you buy it, it's forever.
And that is what podcasters are doing on YouTube right now. Because if you're doing self-sales, that's how you're selling it, right?
Correct. Yeah.
And so we're measuring a lot of that right now too. Again, that's an enormous change in just 18 months of measuring these integrations that are audio and video, or just video, that contain, in some cases, standard kind of ads, and in other cases contain deeper kind of integrations, these branded segments, or even full episodes.
Yeah. And did you say that it's just really been the last 18 months that you guys have started doing more video?
Yeah, video really ascendant. It's been about 18 months, and
Okay.
the minute we could do it, we jumped on it. We could see the signs.
What was keeping you guys from doing it before? Was it a technology thing? It was just demand. Okay, great.
Yeah, absolutely, just demand. I mean, we knew we'd have to have the capability, because it's sort of the value of having these two pillars to our business. On the one side, we do, the brand work, the brand lift work, and on the other side, we deeply study podcast and audio audiences.
Yeah.
Last year we surveyed 65,000 media consumers in the United States, Australia, Canada, and the Netherlands.
Wow.
And 45,000 of them were podcast consumers.
Okay, great. So it's 2/3?
Yeah. And it's just the nature of our work. So we are constantly monitoring and have our finger on the pulse of what are the emerging trends in consumption. So that includes, obviously, the size of the audience, but it's what they consume, where they consume, how they consume, why they consume, are all the questions that we consistently and constantly are investigating, which we knew that video was ascendant. We knew YouTube was ascendant years ago, but it took some time, I think, for the marketplace to catch up to the consumer.
Okay.
And, for the brands specifically to catch on, and therefore need the research to prove out the ROI. Certainly many direct-to-consumer brands, which tend to do less brand research, even though they should, had taken advantage of the video opportunity earlier on. They generally do, right? They're kind of the first ones into any sort of new medium, new channel, or new platform. But I would say larger brands cut up pretty quickly.
Okay, great. And what do you think was the pivotal point that shifted video into something that was like now a real player?
It's a great question. It's a little chicken and egg. The content has to be there. And so definitely some of these shows like New Heights, the Kelsey Brothers, Theo Vaughn, Joe Rogan becoming not Spotify exclusive again.
Yeah.
Call Her Daddy. I think, some big names being very embracing video, I think.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, or at
from
least
the beginning, kind of.
Yeah, exactly. I think from the beginning, exactly. Because they, Rogan started on YouTube, obviously, Call Her Daddy. Those guys started on YouTube.
Right.
So they were always doing video anyway, but I think you're right. I forgot about that the Spotify exclusivity being kind of terminated. Now they can kind of go back.
So a fascinating thing about that is we ran a study with our partners at Sounds Profitable, which is sort of the trade group for podcasting. And we ran it in the fall of 2023, and it was called Sound You Can See. So it's really the first study looking specifically at video podcasting. And at that time, Joe Rogan was still Spotify exclusive. We wanted to explore specifically his audience. So we had a whole section that isolated folks who listen or view Joe Rogan. As a fairly substantial set.
Sure.
And we asked, where do you most often get Joe Rogan? And you know what they told us? YouTube. Now, at the time, he still had a channel.
Mm-hmm.
And it was exclusively excerpts, exclusively clips that could range 5 to 10 minutes. And then he did kind of a weekly UFC special that was longer, right? And I think that was maybe a YouTube exclusive.
Okay.
So that's interesting, right?
Yes.
They didn't say Spotify.
But they're also not listening or watching. They're just watching clips.
If they were on YouTube, that's all they could see. Also, the thing with a Joe Rogan specifically, it's interesting. He's a brand himself.
Correct.
Right. We can't expect consumers to think the way that you and I do always, and to be so specific and bifurcated in how they're thinking about what they consume, right? Because we also told us that they saw him on TikTok. They also told us they saw him on Instagram. And some of that content arguably was not authorized, right? It's somebody else who's, clipped out little pieces of Joe Rogan and is reusing it, or is reacting to Joe Rogan and all of these things, and he's smart enough, his team is smart enough to know that that's more in his benefit than not. They don't stamp it out, right? But he's kind of a brand. And it's one of the complications of him being the most popular podcaster, because in some ways, it's not comparable to other podcasters.
Correct. Yeah.
You can't sort of compare him and Mel Robbins, who's ascendant right now, who's
Mhm.
really built on podcasting in
Yeah.
a different way.
Mhm.
And it's not, again, it's not taking anything away, regardless of whether you agree with Joe or not, or whether you like him or not. It's
Yeah, totally.
speaking strictly from his presence as a media personality, right? It's kind of bigger than podcasting in that way, but
It is.
but then also sort of an interesting object lesson to study.
Yeah, he definitely is. So that's interesting. So as soon as he got out of his exclusivity with Spotify, you saw a huge uptick in YouTube. But also at the same time, it wasn't too much longer after that. I think it was the same with Call Her Daddy, right?
Yeah, and we didn't see like a huge uptick. It's definitely
Okay.
been, since we first saw, YouTube sort of became the platform which consumers say they use most. I always have to be very careful in how we say this.
Correct. Yes.
Right.
We can get into that in a second for sure.
Yeah. In 2022, but we had seen that trend going back several years prior. So we knew that it was ascendant. We didn't know where it would end up. It could plateau, right? It could jump. It doesn't seem like a slow build, but in some ways it was. So it's not this one massive thing. But, then.
Well, I think though media too, you look at a lot of media personalities that have started their own podcasts or their own YouTube channels now. And I do think people are watching that a bit
absolutely.
more versus, you're kind of people are cutting cords in a lot of different ways, right? So you do have that. So there is I think there is like a rising tides lift all ships sentiment, but I think you could definitely point to Rogan as an initiator in that overall movement, right?
Yeah, he's definitely been at least some part of that catalyst. And then in following newer podcasters coming and treating and regarding YouTube as, for them, in many cases, a good place to start if they have the.
Well, it's a great place to start, I think, if you're a podcaster, regardless, because just starting to build views. Right. Even if you're not a YouTube first podcast, and the way I would define that is saying, like, are you shooting for video or are you shooting for audio? You still put it up there, right? I have a personal podcast that I put up on YouTube simply because if you ultimately start to build that audience and build that platform, you could start making money.
Yeah. It's a good place to be found.
Yes.
The jury is out still on the contribution to overall audience building for any given podcast, because
okay, tell me more about that.
The signs are that people consume YouTube differently,
of course,
right?
Differently than
audio podcasts.
Okay, correct.
Right?
Yes. Yeah.
Because you have that homepage, and the homepage is not the same as your subscriptions on Apple Podcasts, who you follow on Apple Podcasts or Spotify or your other podcast apps, right? And so sometimes it highlights different content. And if you kind of fall out of watching something, you stop seeing it in your feed as much, right? And then the algorithm at some point determines maybe you want to see this again because you watch something adjacent. I don't know the algorithm, but there's things.
Sure.
Now, of course, if you want to, you can click into your subscriptions specifically and look at basically the reverse chronology, but it's not what you're faced with when you log in, right? And so I don't actually know what the behavior is. It's something we want to investigate. How much do people use that versus how much do they just go based upon what they're being recommended, and how much do they say ever, hey, I haven't seen that show in a minute. I want to go, what's up with it? What's new? Or is it more lean back? But it does, there are a lot of indicators that YouTube consumption, even for podcasts, is different than people might treat their Apple Podcasts or their Spotify lists.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, that makes perfect sense to me, right? And I'm thinking almost more about it as loyal listeners versus the average kind of fair weather fan.
Yeah. And so it's hard to tell, it seems. And certainly if you look, I mean, this isn't hard for anyone to see. You can look at channels because you can see views, right?
Yes.
And the variability in the number of views between episodes is different than what I know happens on the audio side, which tend to be more consistent.
Even after the removal of the automatic downloads, you still see it being more consistent on audio. I think that makes perfect
Absolutely.
sense.
I think then people see the same thing for the podcasters who can look into their Apple Podcast stats or their direct Spotify creator stats, where that factors out the automatic downloads in many ways.
Yeah.
you still see much more consistency from episode to episode than what you necessarily are seeing on YouTube.
And that makes perfect sense to me, because you go into like an Apple podcast and it's not serving you a whole bunch of there's not as much to do. You go into YouTube, it's like, Disneyland. What do you want to do today? You want to watch a documentary? You want to watch someone fall off a roof? Like, what do you want to do? Right? So there are so many options. I think it's a lot harder, which brings me then to kind of my next question: video versus audio. Like, are brands favoring? Clearly, you guys are now doing the video measurement for podcasts, so brands are doing that. But like, do brands come to you when they're wanting to measure it? Are 9 times out of 10 they're really just doing audio, or are they doing audio and video?
We're seeing both. Sure. We're seeing all of it.
But are they doing them both? Like, will brands do? Let's say I'm going to watch the Jess Phillips show. Okay, and great. So someone is coming to buy advertising on my channel. Are they buying audio and YouTube, or are they just buying audio, or are they just buying YouTube?
It kind of depends on the show. There's just right now it is. I think it's still a lot of test and learn. Honestly,
makes sense.
We have been asked to compare different types of video podcast creatives. Okay. So that might include one that is really strictly the same exact ad that's in audio, just the camera is on.
Right.
We've also done some where it's just a title card. So it's just the brand and maybe the offer on screen.
Oh.
And then we've done ones where the video, it's really truly much more of a video-centric type of ad read, and testing out what is the differences between these. And it's interesting. We're working on we hope to have some benchmarks later this year so that we can really go to the market and provide some guidance, but we just simply have to have enough data in order to do that reliably. Today I could not sit here and tell you that video works better than audio works better than video. The learning I take away consistently in podcasting is that the quality of the creative matters more than anything else. And the questions that get asked always are, should I buy a mid-roll or a pre-roll or a post-roll? What matters more, a 30-second or a 60-second? Like, everybody wants to optimize the quantitative things. Everyone wants to optimize those things. And yet, time and again, what we see makes the difference is the qualitative. Is it a good ad?
But that's always what makes the difference, right?
Right.
That's hard. That's much harder to hit, to get right? No one loses their job if they say, hey, I booked the mid-roll and the pre-roll because those tend to perform. We have a much higher completion rate. Nobody loses their job for doing that.
Yeah.
Right? People lose their job for saying, hey, let's shoot for the moon on this creative, and it totally flops. That's when people lose their jobs.
Right. And yet we've seen creatives flop.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Totally. And I have seen host reads flop.
Okay, great.
Right. So it is not a guaranteed home run, even with a great host.
Right.
I recently wrote a blog post about 3 ways in which you can fumble the host read, right?
Yeah.
Because
let's hear them. What are the 3?
So one, you simply design an ad that isn't good for podcasting. You're asking the host to do something unnatural, and that can be similar for a pre-produced creative or an announcer read. We had a campaign we measured, and we were measuring it for across 3 quarters. And in the first quarter, the creative was on streaming audio and on podcasting. The podcasting one was similar to the streaming one. It was very creative. It wasn't a good fit for podcasting. We saw the numbers immediately. And they weren't the exact same ad. They did tune it for podcasts, but it was still just kind of fringe in a way.
Yep.
And it was pretty clear in the results. Just the channel didn't perform. Now, somebody could have looked at that if they weren't doing the brand lift research and said, well, maybe I guess podcasting isn't a good fit for this brand.
Right.
Luckily, there's a very savvy agency involved with a very savvy buyer, and they were running the brand lift. And so working together, we could look at the results, and it was just very clear signs there. And we came back and said, I know, maybe it's not what you want to hear, but we really recommend taking a somewhat more standard approach here for the next quarter. So they bought some inventory with much more standard host reads. It was still on the same, the entire sort of branding element was the same. They were going after the same kind of copy points, and they're trying to get over the same things. It was night and day.
Meaning
night
what?
And day. Those new lines with the new, more kind of traditional host read beat everything else.
Okay, like by a factor of like 2, 10. I mean, what are we?
I mean, that's not the way it kind of works in brand lift, but it kind of, what we do is they drove more lifts bigger lifts in more metrics.
But enough of a lift that it warrants creating specific copy for podcasts. I think that's really the important question.
And I think it was just they were trying too hard to make it like what they were doing in streaming. And by the way, those streaming ads did well. And part of it is when in radio, in streaming music, the ad has to grab your attention.
Correct.
Because it's an interruption.
Mm-hmm.
In podcasting, the ad should be as little of an interruption as you can get away with.
Exactly.
It doesn't mean it's so organic you can't tell it's an ad. In fact, the Federal Trade Commission might have something to say about that.
Correct.
And plenty of podcasters have transitions into their ads, and it seems to work just fine. Because, your audience is smart. They know an ad when they hear it.
Yeah.
But the less it breaks their attention and holds their attention, the more it holds their attention, we see consistently that is a factor. And so when you give them something too surprising, too weird, again, it's dependent on the podcast, but probably just in general, they go, what is this? And it could be a pleasant surprise. I've seen it happen, but that's hard. You're going to work really hard on that.
Yeah.
And you're not going to have to work nearly as hard on the ad, which doesn't break their attention.
Correct. Because I would almost say, think about it as a conversation. If you're at a dinner party and you're listening to two people really have this incredible discussion and someone pops in and asks you something annoying in an annoying voice, you're like, get out of here. I'm trying to focus in on this. I'm really laser focused. So interruption is unnatural in that state of mind.
Absolutely.
So that makes perfect sense. Okay. So we have, don't ask the host to do something unnatural. Make it as much in the flow state with the podcast as possible.
You can. Again, and that's, and a big thing as well is, in terms of don't ask the host to do something unnatural.
Yeah.
Great podcast hosts aren't necessarily great voice talent. So giving them a script and asking them to read it verbatim isn't natural for all podcasters. And that's where I've seen the situation where a host, an announcer read or producer read, as they can be called, outperform the host read.
Yes.
You got somebody
makes so much sense. Yeah.
Who 8 hours a day just hits the nail on the head, delivers amazing voiceover, right? And so they take something which might even be awkward and they just smooth out those edges because that's their job and that's what they do. And you've got a host whose job it is to be spontaneous and engaging and discursive and full of personality. And now you're asking them to read a book report.
Exactly. Yeah. Just doesn't suit. Okay. So what's the third mistake that people make?
I'm gonna think back to it.
I know. So we said don't ask them to do something unnatural. Make sure that it's not interruptive, that it's conducive to the format and to the conversation as much as possible.
Yeah, and then really don't ask hosts to read things. Ask them to be hosts. And look, there's compliance sometimes.
Sure.
Right. Terms and conditions and things.
Totally.
And yeah, you need to get those verbatim in many cases. Doesn't always have to be the host, by the way.
Correct.
Who gets that verbatim stuff, right?
But you maybe need a fast voice in that, right at the end. Ask your doctor about.
Yeah. Or even if it's not fast voice, it's just you get something in there.
Yes.
It's treating the medium for what it is.
Yes.
Understanding what the hosts are doing for you, and really giving them a little bit of that wiggle room. Because what I've also seen is there are times when maybe the host isn't being asked to do something verbatim, but it's also seems like you're not giving them license as well.
Yeah, this is what we refer to in what I say in influencer marketing. It's the same thing. And I think really this is probably the same for any creative, is that you want to give them a box to play in, because that's when they're at their most creative. You have to give them structure. If you just say whatever you want, that works really well for about 1% of people. Almost everyone else, you're never going to get what you want. So you've got to give some structure to the creative, right?
Absolutely. Yeah, we did a study that was all host reads. So all host reads across well over a dozen podcasts, and it was the results were, there wasn't a lot of lift, but we saw a few hosts who read mostly the same ad, but just a little tiny bit of personalization. One person started with an anecdote, another person started with a joke. Those were both on brand for those hosts. And just the difference, they stood out immediately. We could look at the
Night and
results and
day.
say, okay, these two
Yeah.
shows stood out in the results,
Yeah.
and we think we can trace it back to the creatives.
Totally.
Anyone who would listen to the creatives back to back would hear the difference.
You'd hear the
And
difference.
the other hosts, I think, felt like their hands were tied, probably.
Yeah.
You know?
And I totally see that. And I think that does go back to the same thing with influencers, right? It's just, it's the parallels between this are the same, because I think, as you and I are in agreement, podcasters are in fact influencers.
Absolutely.
But, you know, they have a portfolio. Here's the thing with brands. You aren't going into a dark room where you don't know and you just have to try. The hosts have done host reads before. Go back and listen to them and see if they're interesting, right? It's going to take a little bit more time, but it sounds to me like it's well worth it. It's the same with influencers on Instagram. If you're going to have them on YouTube, shoot content for you. You can look at their feed. Look at their feed, you know what you're going to get, and you can even frame it out to say, hey, I liked it this way. Or when you did this, you started with an antidote, you started with a joke. We loved that. Could you do more of that? That's
Absolutely.
key to success in that creative brief.
Every publisher, every network we work with has copywriters, has a creative staff who are there to help move that along, who know every single host intimately well enough to know this will work for so and so, this won't work for so and so, and will and given the license, will massage that copy, help give those points, and turn it around quickly, which I understand is the other part of the equation.
Correct,
right?
Always important.
Right, we'll probably do it more quickly than most buying teams are ready to do.
Exactly. Yeah, I think that's well said. Absolutely. Oh my goodness. Yeah, you know, I think it's wild to me how similar all of these sort of hurdles are, right? So it just, to me, what I'm going to say to brands is like, if you have influencer marketing staff, maybe bring them into your podcasting buys, right? Consider that. And, you know, the other thing too that I think about is like, really, is this, well, no, I'm going to pause right there and say, okay, I want to make sure that we cover this. So there are three sort of main types of ads, right? There's the programmatic, kind of just regular streaming. There's the host read, and then there's an actor read interruption. Those are the three main types, right?
More or less, yeah.
More or less. And you have said time and time again, I believe in your blog posts, if I'm correctly quoting you, that it's the host reads that outperform, but producer read, well done producer read ads can also perform really, really well. And then obviously the programmatic are they're the least performative.
Well, I mean, programmatic's a buying type, right? And the thing with programmatic is, honestly, I mean, with enough coordination, you can use a host read.
Yes, true.
You can certainly, no problem using an announcer read, producer read type. But what happens, I think, more due to expediency is they end up reusing the creative from other channels.
Correct.
And I've seen every single ad type do well. I've seen every single ad type not do well.
Yeah.
And it's only sometimes that they're pitted head to head on a particular campaign where we're measuring all of the above.
Yes.
So in the times that we've done it, which is plenty, and in the times that I've done it, you know, in my career is plenty, a good host read, and I always have to say this, is that a good host read will generally outperform, especially on those kind of mid-funnel measures. So they tend to move the needle a little bit more on consideration, on recommendation intent, or purchase intent. When it comes to top of funnel, when we're talking about awareness, there's a fair amount of equality there, frankly. Like, and so what that means when giving buying advice, right? Because if you want to get scale, it can be challenging and expensive to do it exclusively with host reads. Although there are lots of networks innovating with host reads in certain ways as well to try and solve for that. So I don't want to say it's an impossibility. It makes sense to mix in at least announcer, producer read creatives.
Correct.
And that they'll work really well for that top of funnel, which you need. And that top of funnel can be not just merely brand awareness, but can be awareness for a particular product, or if you've got a particular objective to building around the awareness to the sort of brand message, if you will.
Yes.
Because and that'll do a lot of work for you that sets up the podcaster to close a deal, right? You know, it's sort of, you go in to buy a car, you work with the salesperson, it's back and forth, right? And you've named your number, and they're going, hold on a second, and they leave, right? And then out comes the sales manager, right? They've warmed you up, they've gotten you there. Now we've got someone there to seal the deal, to close
Correct.
it, right?
Yep.
And I think you can think about that with the way the UC's create is that you can build awareness and actually start to build up a lot of the argument, right? A lot of the features in consideration, but then the podcast host can kind of help seal it for them. They're not doing all the work.
Correct.
Right.
Correct.
The awareness has kind of been built so they can pick up from there and bring it on home.
Yes. Okay. I love this plan. I think this is so wise. And this is what we do a lot with influencer plans when brands come in and say, okay, I have this budget. How do I spend it? What we say is like, yeah, you don't do host reads for the teeny tiny little podcasters, because what happens is you as a brand have to help them construct it. You have to review it, make sure all those things go. And that's a lot of time and effort. So,
it depends on the brand. I will always
Also
caveat it, because you might have the perfect alignment between brand and podcast and audience, where that's, so we test a lot of very large shows.
Okay.
But we've also tested some extremely niche small shows.
Yeah.
Where, when you're getting at IT decision makers, that's not going to be a show that reaches millions.
Yes. And the niches, I think you always have to hold in high regard, and like you have to treat them differently, especially because like if you're talking about like an IT director, there are probably 10 podcasts out there that are actually doing this too, that are actually meaningful. So you can be specific on that. And I do think that is smart.
Right. But if you're talking about Diet Coke.
Correct.
Right?
Yeah. You're trying to spend $2 million on podcasts. We can't do it all in host reads. We can't. So you start with the upper echelon. You say, these are the guys we're willing to invest in. Then you move down to like mid-roll and mid-tier and smaller folks. And you say, okay, here we're going to try to do majority producer, actor-led kind of read content, but not host read. And then look, we're going to test out some of the streaming stuff too, just to see where it falls, because you really truly just never know. And some people don't do host reads.
And it's worth, exactly. And it's worth also looking at, so getting outside the top 10, 20 shows and looking, because podcasting is mostly long tail. It is not television. It's not even Netflix in that way, that we have the same domination of particular, even when we say, Joe Rogan is the most popular podcaster, nowhere near a majority.
Right.
Nowhere near. It's worth kind of getting into that. And I think there's also within that worth looking at some audience niches that might be good for your brand and getting those host reads. So even if using Diet Coke as an example, I don't think they're much of a podcast advertiser really, but you might decide that, hey, well, we'd really like to look more multicultural. And so that would be a great place to run some host reads on podcasts that might be smaller, but where the host read might really deliver a dividend, or we're trying to really go for a sports association, we're trying to really hit this parent association. The Diet Coke is your break in the afternoon. If you want to go after parenting podcasts, they're not going to be the size of Call Her Daddy. That's just right. They just simply aren't. And that it might really end up moving the needle, because that extra influencer, the extra influencer quotient there might make it worth not just the cost, but the additional time and effort that goes into buying it.
Agreed. Yes. Well said. I think it's all important. And I think that the information that you shared today has been so incredibly helpful. So I want to take this time to say thank you for that. And brands, as you're listening and thinking about some of the key takeaways here, I want you to think about how you approach your influencer marketing and consider how that may work with podcasting in terms of the way that you structure it and the way that we do creative briefs and the way that we consider what type of copy and ads we're going to be doing. And then also, if you are north of the six figures, you got to consider Paul, right, to help you with the brand lift study. And that's something that I'm sure that we could very easily work in for anyone who's interested in that. But podcasting is a great space. We know it's moving the needle. It's time to take a look at it. Don't sit on this one. Paul, thank you so much for your time.
Thank you, Jessica. I really appreciate it.